ready.
Cool. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight to Virtually Nowadays. I'm Zoe. I was one of the Safer Spaces monitors when the club was open, and I'm also the community programmer for the stream. We have a really exciting guest tonight who's going to be speaking on some of the most important issues that are going on in the world right now. So welcome so much to Virtually Nowadays. Could you introduce yourself and tell us just a little bit about your work?
Sure. So my name's Alex Vitale. I'm a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College, where I also coordinate the Policing and Social Justice Project. And I'm the author of The End of Policing, which is an attempt to rethink why our society has come to rely on policing for every social problem under the sun and what the alternatives might look like.
Wonderful. Well, those are such important topics today. And before we get started, just because we're kind of touchy-feely people here at Nowadays, I wanted to ask how you're doing after what I'm sure has been an absolutely bonkers couple of wall-to-wall day interview weeks for you.
Yeah, I do 10 to 12 interviews a day.
Wow.
With a little bit of break on the weekends to actually try to remember my kids' names. And somehow, it's working out kind of remarkably. I'm out here in the woods, actually, in rural Massachusetts, quarantining. So maybe a quick walk in the morning before the insanity starts, and that's about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for making time for us. Before we get started on the content of your book, I just want to highlight that you published this almost 3 years ago. And I'm wondering what initially led you to write and publish the book.
Yeah, and actually the deal for the book and I had started working on it, outlined it, happened before Ferguson, before, this latest round of Black Lives Matter activity. And I thought it was going to be a little bit of a curiosity book, for some people who had been focused on things like prison abolition, folks in the critical resistance movement who were trying to do a real rethink on our over-criminalization. And I was like, well, we need to bring policing into the mix, to this conversation. And I've been a police scholar for over 20 years and worked on policing issues long before that in different capacities. And it was just clear to me that, we couldn't fix mass incarceration without dramatically dialing back policing. And while some of the prison abolition folks, they understood this, of course, there hadn't really been a focus on doing research or on kind of making it more concrete. What are the harms that come directly from policing? Because not every police-based harm results in someone going to prison. For one thing, they kill people.
Yeah.
But also they're engaged in a kind of constant low-level harassment and criminalization of some of the most marginal, vulnerable, and otherwise put upon communities in our society.
And so as you're talking about prison abolition, which is a whole other incredible movement, and you reference the people who are working on that, who are some of the people whose work has influenced yours and whose ideas and writings you've drawn on to do your own work?
Sure. Well, I've obviously been influenced by people like Angela Davis and Ruth Wilson Gilmore. Michelle Alexander's work was eye-opening for a whole generation of folks, though it didn't deal with policing. Christian Williams wrote a book called Our Enemies in Blue that really opened up this space and was a big influence for me. He's not an academic. He's a political activist in Portland, Oregon. And I finally got to do an event with him last year, and it was really great. And he does other stuff now, he's not in this space exactly. But I was also heavily influenced by the work happening on the ground. People like Mariam Kaba, who has been a major figure in pushing back against the idea that police are a source of safety. Beth Ritchie's work, Arrested Justice, also from Chicago, who showed that, for Black women in particular, involving the criminal justice system in their lives often leads to worse outcomes for them. It makes them less safe. And I've been just following these movements across the country. The Close the Workhouse campaign in St. Louis, is mobilizing the community to bring political pressure to bear to shift resources from a horrible, decrepit, abusive jail system into community-identified needs.
And so one thing that is really remarkable about the list of people who you just shared, not all of whom I'm familiar with, but that most, and if not all of them, are Black activists and scholars. And I'm interested in how you, as a white person, as a white man, became involved in researching the dangers and the violence of the police, who were generally around to protect white people more than anyone else.
Yeah, it's not an easy question to answer. I mean, I think it was accumulation of things. Maybe growing up in a household that was politically active. I'm a fourth generation unionist.
Mm-hmm.
Alleys were coal miners in Illinois, and I did not grow up in that milieu, but my father did, and I think that had an influenced on me a kind of skepticism about police and the state.
Mm-hmm.
I think really also my involvement in political activism, beginning really in late high school, but in college, and things like the anti-nuclear movement, where I saw the role that police played in suppressing our movements.
Mm-hmm.
But things really became acute when I took a job in 1990 at the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness. I had studied things like urban economic development, housing, community development work in college, and that's what I thought I wanted to do in many ways. And I was doing housing policy for the Homeless Coalition when, the criminalization of homelessness really took on a new level of intensity.
Mm-hmm.
My boss asked me to get involved in that work for our office, and I quickly learned that what was going on was that the city of San Francisco had given up on the possibility of actually housing people, and they had decided instead to turn the problem over to the police to manage, not to solve, but to manage, to put a lid on it, to break up public encampments, to drive people into more marginal spaces. And that was a lesson that stuck with me, that this problem wasn't going to be solved by giving the police sensitivity training about how hard the lives of people without houses are.
Mm-hmm.
That this was about a political failure at the highest levels.
Well, thank you for sharing that history. It's really illustrative of your own journey. And it's a really good segue into starting to talk about your work. You just highlighted how there was a change in the treatment of houseless people. And one thing that your book makes really clear is that, and the other work that you've done, is that policing hasn't always been the way that it is now. That the situation we're in, for instance, with the NYPD, where they have an over $6 billion budget and all this military surplus equipment that they use to terrorize protesters, to say nothing of their overall murder and harassment of Black and brown communities, that this wasn't always the case. So let's start closer to the beginning. What was policing originally like in America, and what did the police do? Why did they start? Where were they? What were they really up to for the beginning of their history here?
So, policing is a fairly recent modern invention. Most police forces in the United States are only about 150 years old, some much less than that. There are some very early forms of policing, though, that go back about 200 years, that help us to kind of unpack what the exact nature of policing is in American society and the functional role that they hold. So I argue that the first police force that I've been able to find anywhere in the world that meets the standard kind of liberal definition of a police force, it's a professional, 24-hour, uniform, civilian, law enforcement-oriented force, is the Charleston City Guard and City Watch and Guard. It's actually formed in the late 1700s.
Okay.
And the reason they're not included, usually you hear about the London Metropolitan Police, who were formed in 1829, and then in the 1830s and 40s you get New York and Boston and Chicago and San Francisco and some other places. But the Charleston City Watch and Guard has been ignored for, I think, one crucial reason, which was that the law that they were primarily enforcing was the law of slavery.
Wow.
They were created to manage a mobile slave population. Because in the big cities of the South during this period, slaves are working outside the home of their owners. These are not plantations. These are urban settings where slave owners house slaves and then basically rent them out as workers, unloading ships in workshops, doing light manufacturing and warehouses, moving stuff around. And they have to travel from the home of their owners to these workplaces and back. And in the process, there's some access to money and free time. And this terrified whites in the city, who by this point are a minority of the population. They are understandably concerned about uprisings, violence from slaves, but even that slaves might learn to read in secret reading groups or form underground speakeasies. So the job of that police force was to enforce laws that prohibited learning to read, that prohibited slaves from spending money, that demanded that slaves not loiter in public places, that required that they present documentation about who their owner was and what the workplace was. Slaves had to wear little metal badges in Charleston. There were different forms of this in other big cities, paper documents or other things, but they were all served an analogous purpose. So policing develops to facilitate the exploitation of enslaved people. We also had colonialism in the United States and colonial policing in places like Texas, where the Texas Rangers were created to exterminate the indigenous population and drive out settlers who had come from Spanish Mexico to make way for white settlement of Texas. And there were similar groups throughout the West who played this role and who become modern law enforcement. And then I'll just give one more example. The first state police force in the United States was the Pennsylvania State Police, created just after 1900, because they couldn't get local police to suppress workers' movements, strikes, and other kinds of activities in the coal fields and in the iron factories of Pennsylvania. And so they needed a force that could be strong enough and not under local control. And the model for the Pennsylvania State Police was the U.S. occupation forces in the Philippines.
Wow.
At the end of the Spanish-American War, the U.S. took control of the Philippines, Cuba, and some other places. And we occupied the Philippines for a long period of time, and we created all kinds of counter-revolutionary policing measures to put down the resistance to colonialization. The state of Pennsylvania went there and took specific officers, technology, and mechanisms of counterinsurgency and brought them to Pennsylvania to suppress these workers' movements.
So what I'm really hearing from what you're saying is that the foundation of the system of policing that we now have in America is based on colonialism, racism, and the suppression of political dissidents. Would you say that's kind of an accurate overall?
Yeah, the way I think about it is that each of these, industrialization, colonialism, and slavery, are regimes of exploitation. They're systems for generating wealth inequality at the expense of the workers. And so people don't want to be exploited. They will resist that exploitation. And policing emerges to put a damper on that resistance with as much political legitimacy as possible, right? So that it's not just the militia lining up and shooting people. It's about a process of preemptively intervening in uprisings, in movements, in labor unions, so that they don't have to shoot people.
I see. And so if you'll permit us to make kind of a long leap from the most recent date you were describing in the early 1900s to the change that you talk about pretty extensively in your book, and that it sounds like you saw firsthand in your work at the Coalition on Homelessness, how did we get from what you were just describing to where we are now? Like, what were those changes, and when did they start?
So obviously today we don't have slavery, and and we don't have colonialism. We barely have industrialization in the United States
Well,
anymore, right?
We have forms of slavery and colonialism, right?
Yes, but not these formalized systems. Yes, there are prisons and there's trafficking of human beings, obviously, but we don't have systematic, legalized slavery on this kind of scale. And colonialism at home doesn't take that same form. So yeah, I don't want to diminish, obviously, the point you're making, but just to say that those are not the primary regimes of economic exploitation in the United States anymore. Instead, we have this kind of neoliberal economic system.
And could you just get into, for the less academic among our viewership?
No, I'll explain what I mean.
Okay, cool.
So neoliberalism is this idea that we have to subsidize and support and give free rein to the already most successful parts of the economy. We have to get rid of any regulations, taxes. We have to actually give them money to incentivize them in hopes that their success will create so much wealth that it will magically trickle down to the rest of us. So we turn everything over to Wall Street. We give Amazon whatever they want to open up a new headquarters in our downtown district. We deregulate their activities. We turn whole cities over to the .coms, and this has not trickled down. It's been great for some real estate interests, and it's been great for the people in those industries, but the rest of us are experiencing tremendous economic precarity. This system has produced mass homelessness, mass untreated mental illness, mass opioid overdose epidemics, mass economic precarity that drives people into underground economies of drugs and sex work and stolen goods and pirated materials, right? And then, rather than actually addressing these problems head on by creating affordable housing, by lifting the minimum wage, they've turned these problems over to the police to manage. Criminalize the homeless. They criminalize people who are involved in black market activity. They fill our failing schools with police. So that's the problems that they're trying to manage. Rather than the resistance of people who are being enslaved and colonized, it's the coping strategies of those who've been left out of the global economy.
Right, who are in many cases descendants of the same populations that were enslaved, that were colonized, that were suppressed when they immigrated to this country. I think that's...
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what are some of the specific moments, movements, pieces of legislation that you could point to as emblematic of these changes?
Well, it's been a long-term bipartisan process. And it's, there's the 200-year part of the story, right, about the formation of police forces that takes us back to slavery and convict leasing and Jim Crow and the ghettoization of northern cities. But there's also this intensification that's happened in the last 40 to 50 years, right, that's associated with the explosive growth in incarceration rates. So in American history, incarceration rates per capita were remarkably flat until we get to the 1970s and 80s, when they just shoot through the roof. So something happened in that period that transformed our relationship to the use of the criminal justice system to manage certain populations. So one factor is the rise of the role of the federal government in law and order politics. And this is accomplished through the Nixon administration, who is looking for a strategy to do two things. One, to suppress his political enemies, which in that case were white anti-war radicals and African-American civil rights movement activists. And they decided that they would use the issue of drugs to criminalize those populations. And the second goal, and to demonize them publicly. And then the second goal was that by doing this, they could appeal to historically democratic whites in the South. Because whites in the South voted almost entirely for the Democratic Party from Reconstruction until the Reagan years, because Lincoln was a Republican and freed the slaves. And so the Democratic Party became the home for racial animus in the American South. Nixon says, Johnson betrayed you with the Civil Rights Acts, cozying up to Martin Luther King Jr. We are the real home for racial animus.
Wow.
And we're going to demonstrate that by criminalizing African Americans through a discourse of law and order and the war on drugs.
And so around the same time...
This is so successful, right, that it becomes bipartisan, so that by the 1990s, Clinton, never wanting to be outdone by the right wing, passes the 1994 Crime Act, which floods local cities with billions of dollars to hire more police, put police in schools, to turn domestic violence efforts over to the criminal justice system. It incentivizes state governments to create harsher penalties for all kinds of laws, to build new prisons. And that continues to be the basic political orientation of both parties.
And so, as you're talking about this, there's a flip side that is related to more things we'll discuss about what it means to end police, what the future could look like. What was happening with social services, with the alternatives to involving police in issues of mental health, of houselessness, of community violence? What were these same administrations doing to those services while they were encouraging an increase of policing and criminalization?
Right. So where did the money come from to pay for all these subsidies to these already successful parts of the economy? It came by eliminating social safety net programs. And so as inequality is getting worse, services for the poor are being decimated. And that's why you get things like mass homelessness. I mean, we did not have mass homelessness before the late 70s and early 80s. It just wasn't a factor in American life, except during the Great Depression and a few other little isolated periods. So it's a double whammy for these populations. Their economic situation, it's a triple whammy, right? They're being excluded from the global economy. The social safety net is pulled out from under them, welfare reform, the Reagan budget cuts, both parties, and then they're criminalized and told that the only resource they can have to address problems in their communities is more police.
So the economic and political context that led to this expansion of police is one thing that you illustrate really wonderfully in your book. But throughout your work, you also talk about this sort of cultural narrative that we have around what the function of police in society should be and who police are, essentially, that they're here to protect us, that they're here to serve us. And I'm wondering where that narrative comes from and who it serves.
Well, one of the most shocking and incredibly pleasant developments of the last 2 weeks is the cancellation of live PD and cops from television. Because for so many people in our society, people who have privilege in their lives, what they know about policing is what they see on television. Because police are not solving their problems in their lives. They don't turn to police if their kid has a drug problem. They have their own resources. They live in stable communities. Police are not this disruptive force for them. And then they watch these TV shows that suggest that, police are the thin blue line between the good people and the bad people, that they're out chasing the bank robbers and serial killers and child rapers,
Yeah.
And this is all just nonsense. Police do not spend their time chasing bank robbers and serial killers. They spend their time harassing homeless people and chasing kids off street corners and putting people in prison for drug dealing and prostitution and sex work and other kinds of survival activities. So these early police force shows like Dragnet and Adam 12 are actually co-produced with police departments, as was Live PD and Cops. And they were designed specifically to try to restore legitimacy to policing in the wake of social unrest. Adam 12 is created after the Watts riots by the LAPD. The chief's office is directly involved in the production of this program. Mm-hmm. And the message they're trying to send is that the police are not brutal racists, that they're professional, clean-cut, upstanding young men here to serve and protect. Mm-hmm. And they create this myth that this is what policing actually looks like in Los Angeles, which has nothing to do with reality.
Yeah. And yeah, like you said, it really is a myth. And I think one thing that is so important to highlight, and that you and many other activists highlight, is that the myth also creates a dichotomy that the image of the police that you just described as these upstanding, fine young men here to serve and protect is the default, and that the police who murder Oscar Grant, who murder Breonna Taylor, who murder George Floyd are bad apples. Could you talk a little bit about that dichotomy and how it upholds the policing system as we currently know it?
So just think about it from this perspective. If your position is that police are essential for solving a whole set of political problems mm-hmm. for you as a politician or a person with power, right? That police are essential. And then the veil of the violence of policing is lifted up, the veil of racism is lifted up. How do you respond to that in order to maintain your ability to use police to solve your political problems? You say, either you don't understand what happened, you don't know what you're talking about, right? So to dismiss it, to deny it, mm-hmm. now we have it on video. It's harder to do that. So then they have to say, well, yeah, that's the one bad officer. We'll get rid of him. The system works. We threw him under the bus. And now you can have your trust in policing restored. And so the reforms that we saw after the first wave of this, right, after Ferguson, after Eric Garner, after Sandra Bland, that first set of reforms was this powerful effort by elites to find something to placate people, mm-hmm. to say, don't worry. We don't actually have to change anything about how we use police in our society. We're going to make them friendlier and nicer and less racist. We're going to give them implicit bias training. Mm-hmm. Because these racially discriminatory outcomes are completely accidental, unintentional, and we'll just remind them to please shoot fewer black people in the future. Uh-huh. It's insulting to police, and it's insulting to us when we're told that this is somehow going to magically fix policing. And millions of dollars have gone into this nonsense so that politicians and police leaders can say, see, we're doing something about the problems of race, while they continue to wage a war on drugs, to criminalize homeless people, to enforce broken windows policing that criminalizes folks who are already in desperate circumstances. So one of the most fantastic things about this moment is that because of the movements that have been percolating on the ground over the last 5 or 6 years, everybody has seen through this nonsense. There are no signs out there calling for more police body cameras or another community meeting with the police. Mm-hmm. That is done. People want the police out of their lives in as many ways possible, and they want real solutions to their community problems.
And before we move into this current moment, which you just provided a great segue to, there is one phrase that you've used repeatedly throughout your work that I think is really illustrative of what you were just talking about, which is procedural policing. Could you just talk a little bit about what that is?
So that's the term that's been used to describe this whole raft of superficial reforms. Mm-hmm. It's based on this concept of procedural justice, okay, which was comes from research that shows that if a judge or a police officer takes the time to explain the procedures of what's happening to this person, gives that person a chance to tell their side of the story, and then they follow the proper lawful procedure, that people feel better about the outcome. Even if they end up getting a ticket, even if they end up getting fined by the judge, because they felt like they had their say. And the procedural justice folks said, well, if the only problem with policing is that they're acting outside procedure, we can train them to take the time to talk to people more, to have some heart-to-heart conversations, and then people will feel better about their being brutalized and needlessly criminalized. And the police can get right back to doing that.
Wow.
That's the problem, right? And the Obama administration embraces this with both arms, creates this task force on 21st century policing report that is just a laundry list of these superficial reforms. And big foundations step in and say, see, we're going to make police friendlier and nicer. We're going to all get together and take a knee and talk about how bad racism is. And then we're going to go arrest your kids for loitering in the park after dark.
Yeah.
Nothing changes. Minneapolis did all of this. The 4 officers who were directly responsible for George Floyd's death had implicit bias training, de-escalation training, mindfulness training. They had implemented procedural requirements that the officers intervene to protect life, to stop police abuse, and it made no difference at all.
Wow. And the last thing actually this is kind of a transition into what's going on right now. One thing that I've been seeing a very significant increased awareness of in this current movement is the role of police unions, both in blocking the kinds of reforms that are being have been suggested in the past, and also their power to prevent whatever meager options politicians offer. They are able generally to pressure politicians out of those as well. What is the role of police unions? What do people need to know about them?
So, I'm a unionist. I'm not in the business of breaking unions. I understand the calls to do that. I don't think they should be part of our labor movement. But more importantly, I think they need to be politically neutralized. Because these unions are not just sitting at the bargaining table arguing over whether or not they should get an extra 2% on their pension.
Which is the role of a traditional labor union.
Right. So, when the teachers go out and advocate for teachers, they're trying to get money for chalk. When police unions go out and say, these are our priority issues, we want to be shielded from prosecution. We want to have our personnel records hidden from the public. We want to have the right to give officers a lawyer before they're interrogated about their misconduct, right? These are not comparable. But politicians take their contributions and endorsements, and then when they come around and say, can you give us this little thing in our contract, they go, oh yeah, sure, or pass a police bill of rights. Yes, we gave that union their thing, and we're going to give your union that thing. And we have to say that that's not going to fly anymore. That any politician who takes a police endorsement or a police campaign contribution cannot be our friend. They are our political enemy. We will no longer support them.
I see.
And the good news is that this is happening. Dozens of politicians in the last 10 days have rejected past police union donations and turned them over to bail funds and mutual aid projects.
Wow.
Yes.
That's
in New York, over 15 that I'm aware of, just in New York City, and this is taking off across the country. People are going into public campaign finance reporting systems and looking for those police unions to see who they have given money to, and then mounting social media pressure campaigns against those politicians, demanding that they turn that money over to community needs.
Wow.
And I encourage everyone watching this to assist this movement.
Well, thank you for that very specific thing that we can all do. And speaking of politicians, not all of them are on board with those sorts of changes, which is a very broad statement. But specifically, we're seeing a lot of politicians, particularly those at the federal level or mayors who are at sort of the top of the hierarchy, hearing calls to abolish or defund or disband the police and responding by saying, well, that's what activists say, but what they really mean is that we need to reform the police. We need to reimagine the police force in our city or our country. And so, this is the title of your book. This is very directly related to your work. What does it actually mean to abolish, defund, or disband, or end the police?
Right. So once we understand that policing is inherently harmful, that it's inherently an engine of inequality, and that reforms cannot work because they misunderstand the nature of the problem. Once we understand all of that, then there's only one other option, which is to remove police from our lives in every way that we possibly can.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no magic switch that we just have to find, and then poof, there are no police.
Right.
There's no city council in the United States who's going to zero out the police budget tomorrow. This is about a process of identifying police functions that are harmful and ineffective and diverting those resources into specific, targeted, community-identified interventions that they feel will make their community safer. Mm-hmm. This is a community safety movement. That's really what this is. If you look at the people leading this work on the ground, mm-hmm. these are people who have been victimized, who have experienced violence in their lives, and for whom police have been part of the problem, not the solution. And they are demanding the resources to actually make their community safer. So all this nonsense about, you just want to, set the purge loose, and you don't care about people's safety, and this is all just abstract utopian nonsense. No, this is people living with violence, demanding relief.
Mm-hmm. So there's no switch, but as we undertake these kinds of changes, what would people who have experienced harm do? What do you do when something is going on in your home, in your community, in your city that you can't handle yourself, that under a traditional model, a person of privilege, white people, might call the police now? What do we do instead?
So keep in mind that in many of these communities, people do not call the police now. The police are a source of danger for them. The police make their lives worse. They abuse and victimize them. They want to keep their family together, but the police come in and throw someone in the prison system. We have to create alternative infrastructures. Mm-hmm. First, that focus on prevention so that things don't become a crisis in the first place, right? Policing only comes into play after the harm has been committed. And even then, they're extremely ineffective about doing anything about it. They take a lot of reports that don't result in anything. Mm-hmm. But also, we know about specific interventions that have evidence behind them that will make people safer. Community-based anti-violence projects that can reduce shootings and homicides by involving people from the community intensively in the lives of those young people who are most likely to be both the victims and the offenders. Mm-hmm. Because almost all young people who are involved in serious violence in our society have first been the victims of violence. Yeah. In their homes, in the community, and nothing is ever done to deal with that trauma. Mm-hmm. Much of which is intergenerational. Yeah. That stems all the way back to convict leasing and Jim Crow and slavery. That has never been really addressed in our society. There's been no reckoning with that history. Yeah. So we need culturally appropriate trauma counseling for young people that takes their experiences seriously. We need pathways to economic self-sufficiency for those young people. people so that they see a future for themselves,
Mm-hmm.
that they have some stake in conformity. And these community-based projects, they help overcome the beefs. They work out truces between people, you know. They do rumor control. No, Jimmy did not shoot your friend. There was a case I remember where a kid died on the playground, and everyone thought, oh, it must have been this other gang that did it. No, the violence interrupters, the credible message came in. No, wait, let's figure out what actually happened. Turned out the poor kid had an aneurysm.
Oh, God. Wow.
Right? It was tragic, but they were going to go beat up the other gang.
Mm-hmm.
Because they just assumed that's who did it. Right? So, but by intervening, the cycle of violence was broken.
So
It works.
Yeah, and so hearing what you're describing, and then also thinking back to a conversation that we had on the Nowadays stream 2 weeks ago about mutual aid, more in response to what was going on with COVID, we had some incredible organizers, Polly Cakes, Regan DeLoggins on, and what they were talking about was that the alternatives that we need to implement already exist in the same communities of color, the same Black and brown communities that have been brutalized for centuries by police, and like you said, know not to call the police. And so what I'm hearing is that the resources are there. We're just kind of listening to the wrong people.
I'm looking for a book. My books got moved, but there's an amazing book called Beyond Survival.
Mm-hmm.
It's about the transformative justice movement, and it's an edited volume of resource materials about community-based safety initiatives beyond survival. So, you know, I highly recommend it. You should have my buddy Ajiris Dixon, one of the co-editors, on to talk about this work.
I love that.
She's just amazing.
And one thing that I want to go back to when we were talking about police unions, you've described just now some of the alternatives for people to policing, but policing is also a labor issue. And I think personally from things that I've learned and read and been exposed to, policing is one of the last sort of secure jobs in America. When there's anti-union legislation, police unions are always exempt. When there are austerity-based budget cuts to social services, as you've talked about, police often get more money. What do we do with the people who were police? How do we transition them out of being violence workers into having other jobs?
Let me tell a little story. I gave a talk in Houston a little while back. You know, I've been crisscrossing the country since the book came out. I'm in like 25 cities a year before COVID. So I was in Houston, and I gave a talk, and some police officers came. They had grown up in Black and Latino communities where policing was a real problem. And they thought, well, maybe if we go into policing, we can change the culture of policing, and we can do something positive for the community. We can turn policing into a way to make the community safe instead of terrorizing people. And they came and they said, but we failed. We could not change the culture of policing. Do you have some ideas? What could we have done differently? And I said, there is no changing the culture of policing. That culture is a direct product of their institutional mission. Instead, let me ask you a question. At the time you decided to join police, if there had been a job at the same pay and benefits, working in a community center, coaching football, this is Texas, of course, and mentoring kids in your own community, which job would you have preferred? And they all laughed. They're like, we would have loved to have had a job in a community center working with kids who are struggling. But there were no such jobs.
Right.
And I'm like, exactly. Why are there never those jobs? The police department is always hiring.
Right.
And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to create those jobs.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, for all the time you've shared with us. We have just a few minutes left, and there are two questions, one of which is very straightforward and one of which is a little bit more open-ended that I'd like to ask you. The first one is just acknowledging that you and I are two white people sitting here talking to each other about a concept that grew out of the work of Black women in the prison abolition movement, and also, as we've acknowledged several times, about an institution that's rooted particularly in anti-Black racism, that's brutalized Black and brown communities for centuries. How do you see your role and the role of white people in this movement against defunding policing?
Yeah, that's a great question. A few things about that. One is that I am very well aware of the privileges that I have in relationship to this movement.
Mm-hmm.
And I consider myself a part of this movement, and I have for 30 years. I was at the early, stages of critical resistance over 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel accountable to that movement, and I am in touch with movement leaders on a daily basis. But I have the privilege of being able to do long-form writing and research. I have the privilege of being able to travel around the country and to be able to articulate these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I try to do that in direct support of the movement, to create political space for those movements, to connect them to resources, whether it's journalists or foundations.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really what this is about. People have said, oh, well, you're just trying to get rich on your book. As you pointed out, the book is free right now,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is not about that. This is about trying to use my position to help build this movement.
Mm-hmm. And also, I'm hearing being in it for the long haul. You've been in
Right. I mean, this was in the works before Ferguson ever happened. I did not drop in out of the sky and say, I'll capitalize on this moment.
Mm-hmm.
I was out doing this work when no one gave two seconds thought about it.
Yeah, and I think that is a really good point. That we're right now we're in this acute moment of focus and uprising, and that for me, what I think about is that white people are the ones who have the easiest opportunity and the fewest consequences to kind of dip when the news moves on, as it inevitably will, and that kind of durational attention and that listening, that following the leaders of the movement is really important. And to that point, my last question for you is, where should people go next? After downloading your book, which, as Professor Vitale said, is free on Verso's website right now, what other people should we be listening to, and what other books should we be reading as we move forward in this work?
Well, we need to connect to these movements, because the only way we're going to win this is to create a new majoritarian politics.
Mm-hmm.
And this means we've got to be able to pressure those sort of middle of the road and liberal white politicians to get behind this movement. So that means you got to get your city council member and your state legislator and your member of Congress behind this movement, wherever
Mm-hmm.
you are. And you have to listen to what's coming out of the movement. You have to learn from that, and you have to try to build some organic connections to that movement. Not to come in and save them and rescue them and tell them what to do, right? But to coordinate with them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it means that you have to be completely subservient. You have to build up a relationship of mutual respect through doing the work.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you're doing the work, if you're getting people to show up and be on with the game plan, if you're turning those legislators in the right direction, then you're part of this movement, and you can be in this conversation. What we don't want is people who have abstract analysis about what the future should like trying to tell us what to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're out here actually talking to people every day, trying to move that needle
Mm-hmm.
in different contexts and different political circumstances. And if you've got resources and political power that you can lend to that cause, then you should do so. You should find these invest, divest movements where you are and ask, what can I do to support this? And they will put you to work.
Wonderful. Well, Professor, again, thank you so much for your time today. We're really pleased to have you, and stay safe out there, and hope to see you again.
Thank you.
Take care. Anyway, yeah, thank you so much for your
We're
time.
out. Okay,
We're
very
out.
good. Okay, good. I hope that was what you were looking for.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You bet. All right. Good luck.
Bye.
Bye.